Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week, Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker. Along with my dad, Pastor Jeff Cranston, we're seeking to not only help you know deep, solid biblical theology, but to know the Word of God and the promises that are given to us in His Word, all while holding to solid theological truths in our heart, soul, and mind. We are working our way through the Bible overview series, jumping back and forth from an Old Testament book to a New Testament book. And Dad, today we're in the Old Testament, and it's a pretty sad book. It's honestly a tough one to read, I think, and maybe even tough to understand without knowing some of the background and what's going on here. When you read it, it sounds more like a funeral dirge than a Bible book. There's really an emotional intensity to it, and it almost feels like as if it's written by someone who witnessed, an eyewitness to really tragic events. So I'm looking forward to see what we're going to learn today.
Yeah, it was. So hi again, Kitchen Table Theologian. And yes, Tiff, you're right about this book. It's terribly sad and written out of grief in response to a national tragedy. And that's something that I imagine most of our Kitchen Table Theology listeners have experienced. Again, it depends on your age, but I'll give you an example, Tiff. What do you recall about September the 11th, 2001? And if my math is right, you were 16 and probably had just started your school day.
Yes, I think I was a junior in high school. I was at school and we were doing an SAT prep class. There was a group of like 8 or 10 of us who had been pulled out of class to do SAT prep. We were all getting ready to take the SAT, apply to colleges. And so we were near the office and heard about it first. People started calling into the school, that all the teachers turned on their TVs. I can't remember if we dismissed early or if just a lot of people left early, but I do remember very specific things about that day. But also I remember not too long after that, the country singer, we love country around here, Alan Jackson.
Yeah.
He wrote a song. It was not long after 9/11 happened. And the first line of the song was, "Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day?" And so many of us can remember. Dad, what about you? Where were you? I have no idea where you were in all of this.
I was in a hotel room in Toccoa, Georgia, the huge metropolis of Toccoa, Georgia. And I was attending a denominational conference. I was still semi in the denomination back in those days. And I was getting ready and the TV was on, had the news on. And just as I was about to leave the room, this news flash came on, and I recall being very shocked and stunned. And then there was this feeling of wariness. I think that everybody was feeling very wary about what is going on here. By the time I reached the conference, the second plane had hit the tower, and then we started hearing reports of the Pentagon attack and a plane crashing in a field in Pennsylvania, and people were very frightened. I do remember them dismissing the conference a little bit early, I think, after we spent some time in corporate prayer. Then everybody went home. So when I got back home here, I got with a few other local pastors, and we organized a multi-church prayer service just I think a day after, maybe 2 days after that.
Mm-hmm. Lots of emotions all tangled up in that day. Kitchen Table Theologian, do you remember where you were on 9/11? You probably, if you were alive and old enough to remember, I'm sure you do have specific memories related to that day. Do you recall the emotions that you experienced? I know I do. There was a lot of fear of the unknown, what was happening, but we see some of these same emotions and feelings in this Old Testament book of Lamentations. So, Dad, let's go ahead and dive into Lamentations. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it? It's probably not a book that a lot of us read very often, probably not preaching a lot of sermons from Lamentations. So give us some background. What's the story here of Lamentations?
Yeah, true. Not a book that's often read, probably. Not a book that's known by a lot of folks. And this book called Lamentations, it reflects on God's judgment of Jerusalem and of the nation Israel. and the utter destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Consistent early Christian Hebrew tradition attributes the authorship to the prophet Jeremiah. So it's been believed for centuries that Jeremiah is the author of this book. And Tiff, you mentioned it, that when you mentioned it has the feel of almost being written by an eyewitness. And that's because I'd say it's probable, highly probable, the book was written by Jeremiah, who was an eyewitness to those things. The book, as far as its date, would be soon after the fall of Jerusalem, and we know that occurred in 586 BC. And then the book has been read annually on the anniversary of that defeat among the Jewish people.
I thought it might be good, before we dive in too deep here, to define the word lamentations. It's not probably a word we hear or use that often. So, kitchen table theologian, maybe you know the meaning of that word, but just in case there are some of us out there who don't, it comes from the word lament, which maybe that's a word that's more familiar to us, I think. Basically, both of those words mean to express sorrow, grief, and mourning.
And interestingly, the original name of the book in Hebrew is the word Ekah, E-K-A-H, and that can be translated as alas or how. When alas with almost like an exclamation point after it, or how with a question mark after it. And so that word gives the sense of weeping or lamenting over some sad event, like woe is us. Alas, that's a word we don't use very often either, but you know it's been around for a long time. Or how, just how could this have happened? There's an element of shock almost to that. The word lamentations was given as a title later on because that word in the English language at least has a little bit clearer, a more emotional meaning. And it's a good title. Not only do we read also that the author of the book witnessed the result of the destruction of Jerusalem. That's in verses 13 to 15 of the first chapter. He seems to have witnessed the invasion of Jerusalem by the Babylonians as well, and how horrible that must have been because they were completely overrun. The city was completely destroyed. And as we know from studying some of the previous Old Testament books we have here on the podcast, that they were taken off into captivity for 70 years.
You mentioned the date 586 BC earlier. Can you put us in context? Where are we at as we read this book in the timeline, the history of Israel?
Yeah, the book opens on a very sad note. And it begins with these words, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. She was a princess among the provinces and has now become a forced laborer. I mean, what a setting. The city, of course, is Jerusalem. Jeremiah had spent the better part of his life walking the streets and the alleyways of God's holy city. Yet in his writings of this book, we find him viewing its destruction, and that brought pain, suffering, heartache. So, and again, I think it makes sense to date the book as close to the destruction and invasion around 586 as possible. So I think that would put it toward the latter part of 586 or the early part of 585 BC.
Okay, so as we read through this book, if you have ever read it or if you're going to read it, I think I was struck, and probably all of us were struck with this pretty uncomfortable things going on, especially in relation to our 21st century evangelical view of God. We see in the Book of Lamentations a side of God that we don't often hear about and don't probably necessarily like to even think about, and that is his judgment on his people.
Yep, so very true. Eric Raymond on the Gospel Coalition website wrote an article 8 years ago entitled, "Can Your Theology Handle the Book of Lamentations?" I saw that article title. I said, I got to look at this. Can your theology handle the Book of Lamentations? So, Tiff, how about reading the opening lines of his article for us. Kitchen Table Theologian, lean in and get a hold of this.
All right, so this is the beginning of the article. Do you find yourself apologizing for God? You may not articulate it in the words, "I'm sorry my God is like this." However, there is some indication that the sharp edges of the character of God are better ignored, diluted, or otherwise recast so as to make his actions more acceptable. Don't misunderstand. I am not talking primarily to liberals here, but rather to evangelicals. Mr. or Mrs. card-carrying evangelical, are you quietly ashamed of some of God's tirades of judgment in the Old Testament? Can your theology handle a book like Lamentations?
I find that to be great writing because that makes me want to continue reading the article, which I
It
did.
does.
And Eric goes on to point out that our functional theology often undermines our confessional theology. In other words, people confess to believe the Bible's inerrant, the Bible's authoritative, but in practice, they and sometimes we become functional editors of the Bible, ignoring this God who judges and only desiring a God who exhibits grace and love. We like it a lot more when God appears, at least to us, as being nice.
And it doesn't appear in Lamentations that God is always nice. And by the way, Kitchen Table Theologian will include a link in today's show notes to that article if you want to go read it. It's a very short but very poignant read, which might be helpful to you to take a look at. So, Dad, how about just a quick overview? We sort of started that, but give us a quick overview, and then we'll examine some of the theological themes that we find in the Book of Lamentations.
Sure. Overview-wise, there's a similarity with the book of Job and Lamentations. So if you think along those lines, it might be helpful to you. A man of God grappling with issues and results of evil and suffering in the world. Lamentations and Job both have that. Now, Job was dealing with unexplained evil. All of this befell his family. He lost his crops. He lost his animals. He lost his children. I mean, and it was unexplained. However, with the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah was lamenting a tragedy with a known source. And it was the rebellion of God's own people, very own people, against him. So the people of this once great city, Jerusalem, experienced the judgment of the holy God, and the results were devastating. But at the heart of the book, at the center of this lament over the effects of sin and evil in the world, sit a few verses devoted to hope in the Lord. And it's in chapter 3, verses 22 to 25. And it's almost right smack in the middle of this book, this statement of faith, that there's hope in the Lord. In spite of all that we're seeing and how horrible all this is, we can still hope in the Lord. So that's a statement of faith. And it's reminding us to stand strong amid surrounding darkness, that the hope that we have in God can shine as a beacon in the darkness, and even to those who are suffering under the consequences of their own sin and disobedience.
Wow. How about, Dad, go ahead and give us a few of the theological themes that we're going to run across in this, I guess, rather short book. There's only 5 chapters in Lamentations, I think. But what are the theological themes?
Yeah, and speaking of that, before I do the theological themes, there's something I find really interesting that when we read the book in English, we never, ever see this. There are 5 chapters here in the book, as you said, and they're written in the original Hebrew in a very unique form. So what we refer to as chapters are really 5 poems. They're structured around the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. 4 of the 5 poems are acrostic. That is, each verse begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in alphabetical sequence. And that was a favorite form of Hebrew poetry because you know why they did it that way? They did it that way to help people memorize the book. So in chapters 1, 2, and 4, now hang in there with me. I won't go too deep with this and with the numbers, but I just think you might find it interesting. In chapters 1, 2, and 4, there are 22 verses in each chapter, 1 verse to a letter. 22 letters in the Hebrew language, in Old Testament Hebrew. In chapter 3, there were 3 verses to each letter. Okay, so in other words, let's go to chapter 1. We would start with the letter A if we were doing it in English, and then the next verse we would start with the letter B. The next verse would start with letter C. In chapter 3, it's like B, B, C, C. So anyway, 3 verses to each letter in chapter 3, making 66 in all. Now, chapter 5 also has 22 verses, but for some reason, they're not in alphabetical order. It's still the Hebrew alphabet, but it's a little mixed up. Yeah. So we'll set that aside. I find that interesting. It's not something that we see in our English Bibles. The emphasis of all of the Book of Lamentations is in the middle chapter 3. 4 of the chapters of the book correspond to another chapter in the book. Now that I've confused you, let me explain. Chapter 1 corresponds to chapter 5.
Okay.
What chapter 1 talks about, chapter 5 also talks about. Chapter 2 corresponds with chapter 4 and 4 to 2. Chapter 3 stands by itself because it's the climax. It's the turning point of the book. Again, these are things we just never glean from reading or studying it in the English.
And that's why all of us here at Kitchen Table Theology are thankful for you. You study these things and find out these things that are so interesting, and I would never learn just reading out of Lamentations in my Bible. So thank you for sharing that with us. All right. I did like that side note there. Very interesting. But let's get back to the theology because it's probably time to start wrapping this up here.
Yeah. So here we go. I'll mention 2 themes briefly. Let's just simply call, and they're very similar. Let's call the first one sin and forgiveness. Sin and forgiveness is a theme. Much of Jeremiah's poetry concerns itself, as you read through, you read about fallen bricks and cracking mortar because of the overrun of the city. And that was not only physically true, that was also serving as a metaphor for the soul in rebellion toward God. The walls have fallen, the mortar is cracked, and just like the city, that's how our hearts are appearing before God. So Lamentations reminds us of the importance not only of mourning over our sin, but of asking the Lord for his forgiveness when we fail him. And when we think, boy, we've really gone too far with this, chapter 3 comes along. He says, no, keep your hope in the Lord.
I love that. So really in the middle of the 3rd chapter there, you see that turning point, and you mentioned that earlier. Okay, so that you said 2 themes. The first one, sin and forgiveness. What's the second one for us?
Well, we could call the other one consequences of sin. Each chapter of Lamentations presents a series of very stark images, and they all elicit a strong emotional response. And as you're reading along, you're seeing mothers driven to consume their own children because of extreme famine. This is part of the reason we don't like to read this book.
Right.
The shocking description of young and old people lying in the streets, just dying. These images evoke pity and horror, and that all coincided with the fall of Jerusalem, but they also serve a higher theological purpose. They vividly illustrate the severe consequences of violating the covenant God had with his people. And they had a covenant with God as well. This went both ways. And they were so far removed from it, so deep in rebellion. So Lamentations helps us to understand more deeply the consequences of human sin. Now, this is a historical book, and so the events in the book are also serving as a foreshadowing of the final judgment to come on the day of the Lord. The common grace that you and I presently enjoy right now is temporary. People say, well, I'm sure glad God doesn't judge like that anymore. It's only because of grace. But one day, the patience runs out. Now, he'll always be a patient God. He'll always be a grace-giving God. But the time will be up on our rebellion, and judgment will again come. So the more we understand, the better we understand the events and judgments in Lamentations, we gain a glimpse into the eschatological reality that awaits us. Eschatological, referring to the end times, what's going to happen at the return of Christ and so forth. So it makes the book not only just an historical account, but a prophetic warning as well. So by grappling, and I'll close with this, by grappling with these complex themes, we not only gain a more comprehensive understanding of sin and suffering, we also see the foreshadowing of Christ's redemptive work. In the end, Lamentations teaches us that even in the depths of despair, though, let's not forget this, and let's end on a high note, even in the depths of despair, hope exists when we turn to Christ, our Redeemer.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'll just ask you again today, would you consider to leave a rating or review, as that really does help us to get the word out. Don't forget, you can check out today's episode notes, and we will link that article that we mentioned also in case you want to follow up and finish reading that. You can check that out and more at jeffcranston.com. You can also email us anytime you have questions. It is pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. As always, thanks are due to our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, and at Streamline Podcast for making this podcast possible. Next week, we may have something different planned for you, so I won't give it away, but we will hopefully see you then. Until then, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it. Thanks for joining us at the table.
You've been listening to the Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. Join us next time for more insights into biblical truth. If you'd like to know more on today's topic, please check out our show notes. If you have a question from today's podcast, kindly email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating and review? We deeply appreciate your help in getting the word out. And be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or in your favorite podcasting app to continue this journey with us as we learn about and apply God's Word to our lives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time here at Kitchen Table Theology.